Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to try to convince you of the importance of sustainable agriculture in the developing world and the importance of reforming the international system of assistance to sustainable agriculture in the developing world. I'm also going to try to convince you that it's important for you. First, the reasons why this is important. Of the approximately 6.5 billion people that live on the planet, 1 billion live in extreme poverty. And ironically, 3/4 of those people live in rural areas dependent on agriculture. If you visit them, which I have in my 40 years in this business, you will see that their agriculture is primitive. It looks very much like their grandparents' agriculture. And in fact, in practically every country in the developing world, you can find these people very easily. And when you look at them, you can ask yourself the question, why in the year 2017 are there people that live in such miserable conditions? Now, a lot of these people turn out, if you look at the statistics, to be those who migrate to the cities. Their situation is so desperate in rural areas that they're willing to go and live often in very bad conditions in the cities because those are better conditions than they live in the countryside. A lot of these people are also the core of migrants. The people that you see on your television sets, for example, migrating from Africa into Europe and often dying on the way, often come from rural areas. Many of the Central Americans that are coming to the United States come actually from rural areas, desperate. They probably don't want to go to Gringo Land. They probably would like to stay where they are, but they can't because they are living in terrible condition. There's another factor to be interested, another factor or reason to be interested in this. The world is losing each year an area of forest equal to the size of Greece. Most of that, not all of it, some is due to logging, some is due to urban sprawl, but most of it is actually caused by farmers. Think about it. Most of the developing world has very, very low productivity growth. Yet populations are expanding. More agricultural products are being produced. How does that occur when productivity growth is so low? Well, the statistics now are pretty clear. It's occurring by people moving into forest areas, pasture land, fragile areas. Every country in the developing world, to a greater or lesser extent, has this problem. I don't know Costa Rica, but I bet you can see it here. The burning of forests, the constant battle between those empowered, often government officials or park rangers, to protect forest areas and fragile areas, largely from farmers. So, what is it that can be done about this situation? There's now a vast literature on this. Literally hundreds of thousands of articles and books have been written about why this situation is so persistent. And I've tried to summarize those hundreds of thousands of articles and books in one slide, right here. Most of them find that this situation persists because government policies in developing countries are prejudicial against agriculture. Most developing countries, not all, and I'm going to get to the exceptions, have policies that actually discriminate against agriculture. Many of them neglect their rural populations in terms of health and education. Very difficult to imagine farm productivity, farm modernization occurring with people who are illiterate, who are uneducated. It doesn't work in any other business. It doesn't work in farming either. And that's largely the cause, or caused by the neglect of governments. And finally, coincident with this neglect is very frequently an enabling environment for private investment, which is not there. Private investors, you probably think of them as big investors, but farmers are businessmen, even subsistence farmers. And when the enabling environment for their investment, whether it's access to credit or access to technology or access to roads or access to water or access to anything is not there, they're not going to develop their agriculture. There's a fourth point, and I'm going to concentrate on that point, which is the fourth point on this slide, which is ineffective agricultural aid. Let's talk about that for a minute. Now, I've participated in that aid program, as you heard, working for the World Bank, the United Nations, and I've worked with USAID, the African Development Bank, the Food and Agriculture Organization, even a little bit with the Gates Foundation. So I know this business very, very well. What is happening here? Well, let's take a step back. Why is there agricultural aid? The reason for that is that the architects of the market-based system that emerged out of World War II were pretty intelligent. They recognized that markets don't benefit everybody. And the response to that in countries at a national level are safety nets of various kinds. Each country has one, or most countries have one, or two, or three. Even my country, the United States, has safety nets for those people who are left behind. But of equal interest was a safety net that was organized internationally. It was to transfer resources from those countries that really benefited from market-based systems, like Europe and the United States, to developing countries, and it was called aid. Billions of dollars have been shifted to developing countries through aid, and agriculture has been a major recipient of that. So it was part of the equilibrating revenues and resources and benefits that you find in countries also was mirrored in the international system. The problem is, after 50 years of that agricultural aid, we still have a situation that I tried to describe to you right in the beginning. Massive rural poverty, agriculture which looks very much like it did 50 years ago. Ineffective agricultural aid. This good intention has not worked. Well, let's look at the other side of this. I presented the negative picture, but there's also a positive picture. There are countries over longer periods of time in the developing world that have done pretty well in their agriculture. And I put some of the stars up here. China and Vietnam are well known. Korea is another. Tend to be in Asia a little bit more than elsewhere. Latin America, Chile, Peru, pretty good. Actually, right now, Peru's agriculture is growing very fast. Even in Africa, which has had more problems, Rwanda, Tanzania for a little while, Ghana, Uganda, I didn't put all the names up here, have done well. So what are the lessons out of those places? Well, it's the mirror image of the negative. In these countries, the most obvious thing has been heavier public investment in agriculture, particularly in China and Vietnam. You see this public investment. These are not pure market-based economies, and yet their agriculture has done well. And their agriculture is largely private, incidentally. It's small farmers. They've invested in infrastructure, in water, in irrigation, in technology. I've visited a city in China that was set up purely for the purpose of developing agricultural technology, with schools that were attached to that technological development. The Chinese have been terrific at this, but others have been pretty good as well. Secondly, an environment which welcomes private investment in agriculture. And in some cases, because you don't find this everywhere, substantial effort in rural education and health. And that fourth little point buried down at the bottom. It's interesting that it's in these countries where agricultural aid has been most effective. The aid from the United Nations and the World Bank to China has been effective. The projects there are evaluated as almost universally successful. So there's clearly some correlations between policies, government policies, which are pro-agriculture, don't necessarily have to be market-based. It can be public investment in agriculture or private. Chile is certainly a privately oriented, and Peru as well, situation. But whatever the case or the source of the investment, pro-agricultural policy also has made aid more effective, correlation. And what you find in these countries is that governments that pay attention to aid. So let me give you two practical cases, both the negative and then the positive. I lived in Kenya for 5 years, managing agricultural projects for the World Bank in the 1980s. And those projects were done simultaneously with projects that were sponsored by other agencies. USAID, for example, the European Commission, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and many NGOs had agriculture projects. Most of us felt that our projects were working. But when you added them all together, they didn't work. Why? One example, agricultural extension. In the 1980s was a big theme of the donors. Agricultural extension is training farmers to deal with that productivity gap. All of these donors, including us and the World Bank, had agricultural extension projects with different models. The Americans had their model, the Swedes had a model, the World Bank had a model, the FAO had a model. What is the result today, 30 years later? Kenya still does not have an agricultural extension system. All of those projects have disappeared without a trace. The tens of millions of dollars put into them were totally wasted. Let me give you the positive example. With my wife, I own 2 farms in the Peruvian Amazon producing coffee and cocoa. In a little province called San Martin, which is one of the poorest provinces in Peru. For those of you who know Peru, this was famous for coca production, for cocaine, the narco trade. Farmers didn't benefit very much from that narco trade. There were people who did benefit from it, but it wasn't the farmers. The place was impoverished, characterized by violence. My wife, happy for me, and most of her siblings migrated out of the country looking for opportunity. She came to the United States, married me. What happened? The Peruvian government was serious about changing this. Very welcoming investment, welcoming private investments, mostly Peruvian, but also foreign, rural infrastructure, and they mobilized donors to assist them in doing this. They managed the donors. Today, there's been a transformation in this province. There's still a little cocoa production, but mostly it's been substituted by rice, cacao for chocolate, high quality cacao, coffee, and various food crops. We see infrastructure there, assisted by donors. The government of Peru managed the donors. This is a case of effective aid. So, based on that experience, what can be done? Well, the easiest thing to say is let's just admonish the majority of developing country governments to implement policies. They can take a choice. It can be very market-oriented or less market-oriented. Look at the Chinese policy or the Vietnamese, or look at Chile or Peru, or look at Rwanda or Ghana or Uganda. But admonishment doesn't work, in my experience. I would hope that more governments duplicate what works and reject what doesn't, but that's pretty tough. That's a pipe dream, particularly given the situation we are in. Remember, millions of people living in poverty, often risking their lives to escape it, and environmental destruction, if you need an image, of an area the size of Greece every year. And with climate change probably exacerbating this situation in the future. So let's move to the aid business. Is there something that can be done to reform that transfer mechanism, that international transfer mechanism, that international safety net, to make it more effective? And that's my idea, the idea behind this TED Talk. I believe that it can be done. Many national governments should also reform their safety nets to make them more effective. But internationally, I believe it can be done by reducing the number of institutions providing aid. There are 150 institutions in the world which provide agricultural aid. And given the resistance of industrial country taxpayers now to any kind of aid, almost all of these institutions, in fact, all of them, are underfinanced. Many of them have gotten to a situation where up to 50% of their funds don't go to farmers. They go to maintaining themselves because their funds are so scarce. What comes first for them is to pay the salaries of their employees. Reduce the number of these institutions and focus the funding on the few of them that do well. This would create a burning platform, an opportunity to reform internally as well, to start pushing projects of the type that work. We, after all, have 50 years of experience, and avoiding the kinds of projects, unfortunately the majority, which turn out to fail. Overcoming that institutional inertia, which often characterizes private firms as well, but public enterprises often have this because they don't have a profit motive that pushes them to do the right thing. So the burning platform, not just the institutional strengthening and reduction, but the burning platform is important. And I would maintain that fewer, bigger, more efficient, lower overhead institutions, learning institutions, would be much more effective as providing this safety net. Now, how to accomplish this? Frankly, the governments that own these institutions and the people that manage them have to recognize the failure of the system. Very often when you're in the system, particularly in the United Nations, people want to do good. It's very difficult to recognize the failure of these systems. They have to recognize the need for fundamental reform by acknowledging the failure of the current system. And another way, a technical way of putting this, is to push for cost effectiveness. The proxy in public institutions for a profit motive is cost effectiveness. And these institutions are the epitome of cost ineffectiveness. So that's another way of looking. Now, why is this important? Well, partly for moral reasons. That doesn't attract everybody. This idea of correcting market distortions so that everybody benefits, which requires some transfer from those who benefit the most to those who benefit not at all. So that's one thing. If you're interested in the environment, surely improving the productivity of farmers so they don't have to cut down the forest to expand their output. They can expand the output on the land that they have. That's important for environmental reasons as well. It may be important for you because you don't want to see your population migrate out of your country. It's an embarrassment, frankly, to have your people wanting to leave to places that don't want them. And the places that receive them look to be less and less accommodating. Certainly in the United States and Europe, this is the case. So there are reasons as well. Aid continues to be needed as this transfer mechanism, this social safety net. But aid, this kind of aid, needs to be fundamentally reformed to become more effective and less costly. Otherwise, that safety net will disappear. Thank you very much.